Picture this. A young woman walks into a military academy where tradition runs deeper than honor, where respect is earned through blood and sweat, and where weakness is crushed before it can take root. The cadets see her small frame, her quiet demeanor, her refusal to boast about her past. They see an easy target. What they don't see is the storm brewing behind her calm eyes. They don't know about the classified missions that turned a scared teenager into a weapon of precision. They can't read the scars hidden beneath her sleeves or understand the weight of the silence she carries. In their arrogance, they mistake her humility for helplessness, her patience for weakness, her desire for peace as an invitation for war. They're about to learn the most dangerous lesson of their lives. Never judge a warrior by the quiet they keep. Because when that silence breaks, when that patience runs dry, when that desire for peace transforms into a need for justice, the reckoning that follows will redefine everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and what it truly means to be unstoppable. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, when the underdog reveals they were never the underdog at all, and when a single person's truth becomes powerful enough to shatter an entire system built on lies and intimidation. The cadets think they're dealing with just another new recruit. They have no idea they've just declared war on a Navy SEAL combat veteran who's been holding back her entire life, waiting for the moment when holding back would no longer be an option. That moment has arrived. The morning fog rolled across the grounds of Riverside Military Academy like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of marching feet and shouted commands. Sarah Chun stepped out of the black sedan that had brought her from the airport, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. At 22, she looked younger than her years, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a slender build that seemed almost fragile against the imposing backdrop of the academy's stone buildings. The driver, a gruff man in his 50s who had served as a Marine decades earlier, glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You sure about this, miss? This place has a reputation for eating people alive, especially." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Especially women." Sarah finished quietly, her voice carrying no anger, just a calm acknowledgement of reality. "I'm sure." As she walked toward the main administration building, her steps were measured and purposeful, but not in the aggressive way that many newcomers adopted to Project Strength. Instead, there was something almost meditative about her movement, as if she had trained herself to conserve energy for when it would truly be needed. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes that gave no hint of her background. Jeans, a plain gray sweater, and well-worn boots that had seen more miles than most people would walk in a lifetime. The academy buzzed with the energy of a new semester beginning. Cadets moved in precise formations across the courtyard, their uniforms crisp and their bearing proud. Sarah observed them with the trained eye of someone who had learned to read people's movements, their confidence levels, their potential for violence. It was an unconscious assessment, born from years of training that had become as natural as breathing. Inside the administration building, she was directed to a small office where Colonel Marcus Hendricks waited. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair cropped short, and eyes that had seen too much of war to be surprised by anything. When Sarah entered and saluted properly, he studied her for a long moment. "Miss Chun," he said, returning her salute before gesturing to a chair. "Your application was unusual. Most of our cadets come straight from high school after a brief stint in junior college. You're older, and your background check came back with significant redactions. Care to explain?" Sarah sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap. "I served with the Navy for 4 years, sir. Special operations. The details are classified, but I can provide verification through proper channels if needed." Colonel Hendricks raised an eyebrow. Navy Special Operations at her age was impressive, but something in her manner suggested there was more to the story. "And now you want to complete your education here? We're primarily a leadership academy, Miss Chun." Most of our graduates go on to become officers in various branches of the military or take leadership positions in civilian sectors. That's exactly what I'm looking for, sir. I have the tactical training, but I want to develop my leadership skills in a structured environment. I believe this academy can provide that. What Sarah didn't mention was the real reason she was here. After 4 years of missions that had taken her to places that didn't exist on public maps, after operations that had tested every limit of her physical and mental endurance, she was trying to find a way back to something resembling a normal life. The Navy had offered her advancement, promotions, and opportunities that most people her age could only dream of. But Sarah had seen enough of war to know that she needed to find a different path, one that would let her use her skills to build rather than destroy. The academy represented a bridge between her old life and whatever came next. Here, she could learn to lead in peacetime, to inspire rather than intimidate, to protect through strength rather than through violence. At least, that was her hope. Colonel Hendricks reviewed her paperwork one more time. You'll be assigned to Delta Company. They're a good group of cadets, though they can be challenging to newcomers. I trust you can handle yourself? Yes, sir. Good. Your room assignment is in Building C, 3rd floor. Classes start tomorrow at 0600. Any questions? Sarah shook her head. She had memorized the academy's layout, schedule, and policies weeks before arriving. Preparation was a habit that had kept her alive through missions where the margin for error was measured in milliseconds. After collecting her room key and schedule, Sarah made her way to Building C. The dormitory was a 3-story brick structure that housed about 60 cadets. As she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, she could hear voices from the common room. Mostly male voices, loud and confident in the way that young men often were when they felt they had something to prove. Her room was spartanly furnished. 2 beds, 2 desks, 2 small wardrobes. Her roommate had already arrived and claimed the bed by the window. Personal items scattered across the desk suggested someone who was comfortable taking up space. Military academy brochures, family photos, and what looked like acceptance letters from several colleges. Sarah set her duffel bag on the unclaimed bed and began unpacking with the methodical efficiency she had learned during her first week of basic training 6 years earlier. Everything had a place, everything served a purpose, and nothing was wasted. Her civilian clothes went into the wardrobe. Her toiletries were arranged precisely on the small shelf above her desk, and her few personal items, a worn copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a photo of her parents, and a small wooden carving of a dolphin that had been a gift from her SEAL team, were placed carefully on her nightstand. As she was making her bed, with hospital corners that could bounce a quarter, the door burst open and her roommate entered. She was a tall, athletic young woman with blonde hair, pulled back in a perfect bun, and the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being told she was destined for greatness. "Oh, you must be my roommate," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Jennifer Lawson. Most people call me Jen. My father's Colonel Lawson. He graduated from here in '85 and went on to command the 82nd Airborne. I'm planning to follow in his footsteps, maybe even surpass them if I'm being honest." Sarah shook her hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. "Sarah Chun, nice to meet you." Jen studied her new roommate with obvious curiosity. "You're older than most of the incoming cadets. Military background?" "Navy. Enlisted." Sarah nodded, not offering additional details. "Well, that'll actually help you here. A lot of the cadets come straight from high school and have never had to deal with real military discipline. Having enlisted experience will give you a leg up on understanding how things actually work versus how they're supposed to work on paper." Jin's tone was friendly but carried an undertone that suggested she was already categorizing Sarah, placing her into a box labeled useful but not threatening. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. 3 male cadets stood in the hallway, all wearing the academy's gray and blue uniforms with the casual confidence of upperclassmen who owned their territory. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of square jaw that belonged in recruitment posters. His name tag read Morrison, and the chevrons on his sleeve indicated he was a senior cadet with some level of command authority. "Ladies," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, "thought we'd come by and welcome our new additions to Delta Company. I'm Cadet Captain Morrison. This is Cadet Lieutenant Davis and Cadet Sergeant Brooks." Davis was wiry and intense, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. Brooks was stockier, with red hair and freckles that might have made him look harmless if not for the calculating way he studied Sarah. "Jennifer Lawson," Jen said, stepping forward to shake hands. "Looking forward to working with Delta Company. And you are?" Morrison's attention turned to Sarah. Sarah Chun. She didn't step forward to shake hands, and something in her stillness seemed to register with the three men. It wasn't defiance exactly, but it wasn't submission either. It was the kind of calm alertness that predators recognized in other predators. "Sarah's Navy," Jen offered helpfully. "Enlisted experience." "Is that so?" Davis leaned against the doorframe. "What was your rate?" "Classified specialty," Sarah replied simply. Brooks laughed, though it wasn't entirely friendly. "Classified, huh? Or were you some kind of secret agent?" Sarah's expression didn't change. "Something like that." The three cadets exchanged glances. They had come here expecting to establish the hierarchy with two new female cadets who would need to understand their place in the company's social order. Jen had responded exactly as expected. Friendly, cooperative, clearly eager to fit in. But Sarah's responses were creating a different dynamic, one they weren't quite sure how to handle. "Well," Morrison said after a moment, "orientation starts tomorrow at 0500. Formation is in the courtyard. Don't be late. We're in a tight ship here." After they left, Jen turned to Sarah with curiosity. "What exactly did you do in the Navy? I mean, I won't push if you can't talk about it, but classified specialty could mean anything from intelligence analysis to things that aren't discussed in polite company," Sarah finished quietly. "Let's just say I was very good at my job." That evening, Sarah made her way to the dining hall for dinner. The large room buzzed with conversation as nearly 200 cadets filled the long tables. She collected a tray and selected her food carefully. Enough protein to maintain her strength, enough carbohydrates to fuel her morning runs, nothing that would make her sluggish or slow her reflexes. Old habits died hard. She found an empty spot at the end of a table occupied mostly by first-year cadets. They were easy to identify by their nervous energy and the way they kept glancing around to make sure they weren't violating any unspoken rules. Sarah ate in silence, listening to the conversations around her while maintaining the kind of situational awareness that had been drilled into her during her first week of SEAL training. The social dynamics of the academy were already becoming clear. The upperclassmen held court at tables near the center of the room, their voices loud and confident as they told stories designed to impress and intimidate. The younger cadets clustered at tables closer to the edges, speaking in quieter tones and occasionally throwing admiring or nervous glances toward their seniors. It was a hierarchy based on time served and proven ability, but Sarah could see the flaws in it. Some of the upperclassmen were clearly natural leaders who had earned their positions through competence and character. Others had simply learned to project confidence while hiding their insecurities behind aggression and bluster. The latter group was the one that would pose problems. As she was finishing her meal, she noticed Morrison approaching with Davis and Brooks flanking him. They stopped at her table, effectively trapping her in conversation whether she wanted one or not. "Mind if we sit?" Morrison asked, though he was already pulling out a chair. Sarah gestured to the empty seats without speaking. "So, Sarah," Davis began, "we've been talking about your mysterious Navy background. The thing is, we've all got military families. My dad's a Marine colonel. Brooks' grandfather was in the 101st Airborne. Morrison's uncle commanded a destroyer during the Gulf War. We know military, and we're having a hard time figuring out where you fit. Why does it matter?" Sarah asked quietly. "Because," Brooks leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimidating register, "this isn't some civilian college where everyone pretends to be equal. This is a military academy with a clear chain of command and established traditions. Everyone here has to prove themselves, and everyone here has to know their place. Sarah set down her fork and looked at each of them in turn. Her gaze was steady and unblinking, and for just a moment, something flickered behind her calm exterior, something that made all three upperclassmen shift slightly in their seats. "And what place do you think I should know?" she asked. Morrison cleared his throat. "Look, we're not trying to be hostile here, but you're new, you're female, and you're not giving us much to work with in terms of background. In an environment like this, that makes people nervous. Maybe if you shared a little more about your service record, we could all understand each other better." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft that the three men had to lean in to hear her. "You want to know about my service record? Here's what I can tell you. I spent 4 years learning that the most dangerous people are usually the ones who don't need to tell everyone how dangerous they are." She stood up, collected her tray, and walked away without another word, leaving the three upperclassmen staring after her. Later that night, as Sarah lay in her narrow bed, listening to Jen's quiet breathing from across the room, she reflected on her first day at the academy. She had come here hoping to leave her old life behind, to learn new ways of leading that didn't involve the kind of violence she had become so expert at delivering. But already she could see that her hopes might have been naive. The academy operated on the same principles as every military organization she had ever encountered. Strength was respected, weakness was exploited, and those who didn't fit neatly into established categories were viewed with suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of acceptance or powerful enough to demand it. Sarah had spent the last 4 years proving herself in environments where failure meant death, and success meant the chance to face even deadlier challenges. She had hoped that civilian military education would be different, that she could find a way to belong without having to demonstrate the full extent of what she was capable of. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison, Davis, and Brooks had already made their decision about her. They saw her as a problem to be solved, a challenge to their authority that needed to be addressed before it could spread. What they didn't understand was that Sarah had faced real challenges before, not the artificial ones created by academy hierarchies and social dynamics, but the kind where nations rose and fell based on whether she succeeded or failed. She had learned to be patient, to observe, to wait for the right moment to act. If they wanted to test her, she would let them. If they wanted to push her, she would bend until the moment came when bending was no longer possible. And when that moment came, they would discover that they had never been dealing with just another cadet trying to find her place in their world. They had been playing games with someone who had learned to win wars. The alarm clock's shrill cry cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 0445, 15 minutes before the official wake-up call. Sarah was already awake, had been for the past 20 minutes, lying still and listening to the rhythm of the academy waking up around her. It was a habit from her operational days. Always be ready before you need to be ready. She slipped out of bed silently, not wanting to wake Jen, and padded to the small bathroom they shared with the 2 cadets in the adjacent room. By the time the official wake-up call echoed through the hallways at 0500, Sarah was dressed, her bed was made to inspection standards, and she was lacing up her running shoes. Jen stirred as Sarah was putting on her academy sweatshirt. "God, you're like a ghost," she mumbled, checking her watch. "How are you even functional at this hour?" "Practice," Sarah replied simply. The first formation of the day was held in the central courtyard, where nearly 200 cadets assembled in company formations as the sky slowly lightened from black to deep purple. Sarah found her place in Delta Company's ranks, standing at attention while the senior cadets conducted roll call and announced the day's schedule. Cadet Captain Morrison stood at the front of Delta Company, his posture perfect and his voice carrying easily across the formation. "Today begins another semester at this academy, and that means we maintain the standards that have made Delta Company the premier unit at Riverside. For our new cadets, understand that excellence is not negotiable here. You will meet our standards, or you will find yourself seeking education elsewhere." His eyes found Sarah in the ranks, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Physical training begins immediately after formation. We'll see what our new additions are made of. The physical training session was designed to be grueling. The upperclassmen led the company through a series of exercises that would have challenged experienced athletes. Push-ups, sit-ups, mountain climbers, and burpees performed in rapid succession with minimal rest between sets. Sarah moved through the exercises with mechanical precision, her breathing controlled and her form textbook perfect. Around her, other cadets began to struggle. First-year students who had been high school athletes found themselves gasping for air. Even some of the upperclassmen showed signs of strain as the workout continued. But Sarah maintained the same steady rhythm, as if she could continue indefinitely. Cadet Sergeant Brooks, who was leading the PT session, began to focus on her specifically. "Chun, you think you're impressing someone with that robot routine? Let's see how you handle some individual attention." He had Sarah step forward and demonstrate proper push-up form for the company. She dropped into position and began a set of perfect push-ups while he critiqued her technique. But instead of finding flaws to exploit, he found himself running out of criticism as she maintained flawless form through 20, 30, 40 repetitions. "That's enough," he said finally, though Sarah showed no signs of fatigue. The breakfast formation that followed was held in military silence, with cadets eating their meals without conversation. Sarah noticed that she had become the subject of whispered discussions at other tables, though the conversations stopped whenever she looked in their direction. After breakfast came the academic portion of the day. Sarah's first class was military history, taught by Professor Williams, a retired Army colonel who had written extensively on modern warfare tactics. The classroom was arranged in tiered rows, with Sarah finding a seat in the middle section. As students filed in, she observed the social groupings that were already forming. The upperclassmen claimed the back rows, projecting an air of casual authority. The more academically focused cadets gravitated toward the front. Sarah chose her position to maintain good sight lines to all exits while remaining unremarkable, another old habit that she couldn't quite shake. Professor Williams began the semester by discussing the evolution of military leadership, from ancient battlefield commanders to modern special operations teams. His lecture touched on the difference between authority granted by rank and influence earned through competence and character. True military leadership, he explained, is not about commanding obedience through fear or intimidation. It's about inspiring others to achieve objectives they didn't think were possible, often under conditions where failure has consequences far beyond personal disappointment. Sarah found herself genuinely engaged with the material. This was exactly what she had hoped to find at the academy, a deeper understanding of leadership principles that went beyond the tactical level she had mastered during her Navy service. After class, as students were filing out, Cadet Lieutenant Davis approached her. "Interesting perspective Professor Williams has on leadership, don't you think?" Sarah nodded. "It's consistent with what I've observed in the field." "The field?" Davis raised an eyebrow. "Most enlisted personnel don't get much exposure to strategic leadership concepts. What exactly was your rate in the Navy?" "I told you yesterday. Classified specialty." Davis stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, Chun, we're all going to be living and working together for the next few years. The mysterious act might seem cool to you, but it's not building trust with your company mates. Maybe it's time to be a little more forthcoming about your background." Sarah studied his face for a moment. Davis was intelligent. That much was clear, but his intelligence was paired with an impatience that could make him dangerous. He was the type who would push boundaries not out of malice, but out of a need to understand and control his environment. "Trust," Sarah said quietly, "is earned through actions, not through stories about the past." She walked away, leaving Davis standing in the hallway with a frustrated expression. The afternoon brought combat training in the Academy's gymnasium. The session was led by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a Marine veteran with 25 years of service who had been brought in specifically to teach hand-to-hand combat and weapons handling. The class began with basic grappling techniques, with cadets pairing off to practice holds and escapes. Sarah was partnered with another first-year cadet named Thompson, a nervous young man who clearly had never been in a physical altercation in his life. As they worked through the prescribed movements, Sarah was careful to moderate her responses. She demonstrated the techniques accurately, but without the fluid precision that would have revealed the depth of her training. When Thompson attempted to apply a hold incorrectly, she gently corrected his form rather than exploiting his mistakes. Master Sergeant Rodriguez moved through the pairs, offering guidance and correction. When he reached Sarah and Thompson, he watched them work for several minutes before commenting. "Chin, your form is excellent. Have you trained in martial arts before?" "Some basic training in the Navy, Sergeant." Rodriguez nodded, but something in his experience I suggested he recognized more than basic training when he saw it. "Thompson, watch how Chun maintains her balance during the transition. See how her center of gravity never shifts unnecessarily." After the demonstration, Rodriguez called for a rotation of partners. Sarah found herself paired with Brooks, who approached the exercise with obvious enthusiasm. "Finally, get a chance to see what our mysterious Navy girl is really made of," he said with a grin that carried an edge. They began with basic grappling, following the prescribed drills. Brooks was strong and athletic with the kind of aggressive approach that worked well against opponents who could be intimidated. He applied more pressure than necessary, held positions longer than the drill required, and generally treated the exercise as a competition rather than a learning opportunity. Sarah accommodated his approach, allowing him to feel successful while subtly controlling the pace and intensity of their engagement. When he attempted to apply submission holds with excessive force, she would flow out of them so smoothly that he couldn't quite understand how she had escaped. "Interesting technique," Brooks panted after Sarah had slipped out of his third attempt at a chokehold. "Where exactly did you learn that?" "Navy taught us to be adaptable," Sarah replied calmly. Their sparring attracted attention from other cadets, partly because Brooks was known as one of the better fighters in the company, and partly because of the growing speculation about Sarah's background. Master Sergeant Rodriguez also began paying closer attention to their pair. When Brooks attempted a takedown that relied more on brute force than technique, Sarah's response was so automatic that she had countered and reversed their positions before her conscious mind could stop her. For a split second, Brooks found himself flat on his back with Sarah controlling his arm in a joint lock that could have been devastating if applied with full pressure. She released him immediately and helped him to his feet, but the damage to his ego was already done. Around them, other cadets had stopped their own drilling to watch, and the whispered conversations would continue long after class ended. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached them. That was a textbook counter to an overcommit takedown attempt. "Chin, where exactly did you serve in the Navy?" "Various assignments, Sergeant." Rodriguez studied her with the eyes of a man who had trained elite warriors for decades. "I see. Well, continue with the drills." That evening, as Sarah sat in her room reviewing the day's academic assignments, Jen burst through the door with obvious excitement. "You're all anyone's talking about," she announced, dropping into her desk chair. "The whole company is buzzing about what happened in combat class today. Brooks is telling everyone that you got lucky, but Rodriguez looked impressed. And Morrison is, well, he's not happy." Sarah looked up from her textbook. "Not happy about what?" "About not being able to figure you out. He's used to being the alpha male in any situation, and you're not playing by the expected rules. It's making him nervous, which makes him dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Jen leaned forward conspiratorially. "Morrison has connections here. His father is a major general. His uncle sits on the Academy's board of advisors. When Morrison decides someone doesn't fit into his vision of how things should work, he has resources to make their life very difficult." Sarah set down her book. "What kind of resources?" "Academic pressure, social isolation, disciplinary actions for minor infractions that other cadets would get warnings for. He's very good at making problems disappear while maintaining plausible deniability. And you're telling me this because I like you, and I think you're probably a good person who doesn't deserve whatever Morrison is planning." Also because I'm curious about what happens when someone with your mysterious background gets pushed too far. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this information. She had hoped to avoid the kind of conflict that Jen was describing, but she was beginning to realize that hope might have been naive. "What would you do?" she asked. "Me? I'd probably try to find a way to make peace with Morrison. Give him something he wants, respect, acknowledgement of his authority, maybe some information about my background that makes me less of a mystery. But I don't think that's an option for you." "Why not?" Yen smiled. "Because whatever you really are, you're not the type to back down from bullies. I can see it in how you carry yourself, how you respond to pressure. You're way too calm for someone who's planning to compromise." Later that night, Sarah lay awake thinking about her conversation with Jen. Her roommate was perceptive. Sarah was indeed not the type to back down for bullies. But her usual methods for dealing with aggressive personalities were not appropriate for an academic environment. In the field, problems like Morrison were handled decisively and permanently. Threats were neutralized before they could escalate, and dominance was established through overwhelming demonstration of capability. But here, in this carefully structured environment where she was trying to build a different kind of future, those methods would only create bigger problems. She needed a new approach, one that would establish boundaries without revealing too much about who she really was or what she was capable of. The challenge was finding a way to make Morrison and his allies understand that pushing her further would be a mistake, while still maintaining the peaceful facade she had come here to build. Around midnight, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her room. They paused at her door for several seconds before moving on. It could have been innocent, a cadet heading to the bathroom or returning from a late study session. But something about the deliberate pace and the length of the pause made her instincts prick up. Sarah slipped out of bed and moved silently to the door, listening carefully. The footsteps had stopped at the end of the hallway, near the stairwell. She could hear muffled voices, too quiet to make out words, but carrying the tone of people planning something they didn't want overheard. After several minutes, the voices faded and the footsteps resumed, heading down the stairs and away from the dormitory. Sarah remained by the door for another 10 minutes, listening to the building settle back into the quiet rhythms of night. When she finally returned to bed, she made a mental note to start varying her daily routines. If Morrison and his allies were beginning surveillance and reconnaissance, they were moving beyond simple intimidation into more serious territory. The next morning brought advanced tactics class, where cadets studied historical battles and analyzed the decision-making processes that led to victory or defeat. Sarah found herself genuinely engaged with the material, particularly the discussions about adapting classical military principles to modern asymmetric warfare. During a break between classes, she was approached by Cadet Patricia Santos, a junior who served as Delta Company's executive officer. Santos was known for being fair, but demanding, with a reputation for excellence that was earned rather than inherited. "Chun, I want to talk to you about something," Santos said, leading Sarah away from the other cadets. "I've been watching how you've integrated into the company over the past few days, and I want to give you some advice." Sarah waited for her to continue. "Morrison is planning something. I don't know exactly what, but I know how he operates. He's going to engineer a situation where you have to choose between backing down publicly or escalating into a confrontation that will get you expelled. Why are you telling me this? Because I don't like bullies, and because I think the company would benefit from having someone with your background and bearing as part of our leadership structure. But that can only happen if you survive Morrison's attention long enough to prove yourself through normal channels." Santos paused, studying Sarah's face. "The thing is, I get the feeling that you could handle Morrison and his whole crew without breaking a sweat. But if you do that, you'll confirm every suspicion they have about you being some kind of threat to the established order. What do you suggest? Document everything. Build alliances with other cadets who are tired of Morrison's methods. And when he finally makes his move, respond in a way that exposes him rather than just defeating him." Sarah nodded slowly. Santos was giving her good advice, the kind that might allow her to neutralize the threat Morrison represented without destroying her chances of building the new life she wanted. But as she walked to her next class, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison wasn't going to give her the luxury of choosing her own timeline for confrontation. He was already moving, already planning, and whatever he had in mind was designed to force her hand sooner rather than later. The question was whether she would be able to respond as Sarah Chun, the Academy cadet, or whether circumstances would require her to become someone else entirely, someone whose methods would leave no doubt about what kind of war Morrison had chosen to start. The first sign that Morrison was escalating his campaign came during the third week of the semester. Sarah arrived at her room after evening study hall to find her door slightly ajar, not enough to be obvious, but enough for someone with her training to notice immediately. She paused in the hallway, listening carefully before pushing the door open with her foot while staying positioned to move quickly if needed. The room appeared normal at first glance, but Sarah's trained eye caught the subtle signs of intrusion. Her books had been moved slightly on her desk. The corners of her bed sheets weren't quite as precise as she had left them. Most telling, the small wooden dolphin on her nightstand had been rotated exactly 90 degrees from its original position. Jen was at her own desk, apparently engrossed in a chemistry assignment. "Hey," she said without looking up. "How was study hall?" "Fine," Sarah replied, moving to examine her belongings more closely. "Anyone come by the room while I was out?" "Morrison and Davis stopped by about an hour ago. Said they were doing room inspections for the company. They were only here for a few minutes." Sarah opened her wardrobe and checked her clothes. Everything was there, but the order had been subtly altered. Someone had conducted a thorough search while trying to make it appear that nothing had been disturbed. "What were they looking for?" Jen asked, finally turning around. "Information," Sarah said simply. She had been careful not to bring anything that could reveal details about her Navy service, but the search confirmed that Morrison was moving beyond simple intimidation. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the dormitory settling into sleep. Around 0200 hours, she heard the soft scrape of her door handle turning. She remained perfectly still, controlling her breathing while tracking the intruder's movement through her room by sound alone. Whoever was moved with practiced stealth, but not the kind of silent movement that came from professional training. This was someone who had learned to be quiet through necessity rather than education, probably years of sneaking around dormitories and family homes. The intruder spent several minutes at her desk, apparently photographing her assignments and personal notes with a phone camera. Then they moved to her wardrobe, conducting another search of her belongings. Sarah waited until the person had left, and the building had been quiet for 30 minutes before getting up to assess what had been taken or planted. Nothing was missing, but she found a small listening device taped under her desk drawer, amateur surveillance equipment that could be purchased online for less than $50. She left the device in place, but made a note of its frequency and transmission range. If Morrison wanted to eavesdrop on her conversations, she would make sure he heard exactly what she wanted him to hear. The next morning brought the weekly combat evaluation, where cadets were tested on their proficiency in various fighting disciplines. Sarah had been dreading this moment, because it would be impossible to demonstrate basic competence without revealing more of her capabilities than she wanted to show. The evaluation was conducted by Master Sergeant Rodriguez with assistance from several upperclassmen, including Morrison and Brooks. Cadets were tested in pairs, with their performance graded on technique, aggression, and adaptability. Sarah was paired with Thompson again, which should have been a safe matchup. Thompson was improving under her guidance, but he was still far from being a threat to anyone with real training. The evaluation should have been routine, demonstrate basic techniques, help Thompson look competent, receive a passing grade, and move on. But as they began their demonstration, Sarah noticed that Morrison had positioned himself where he could clearly observe her every movement. More concerning, she spotted Davis with a camera, ostensibly recording evaluations for training purposes, but clearly focused on capturing her performance. The prescribed routine called for basic grappling followed by defensive techniques. Sarah moved through the exercises carefully, showing competence without excellence, helping Thompson through the more complex movements while appearing to struggle with some of them herself. But halfway through the evaluation, Master Sergeant Rodriguez called for a change. Thompson stepped back. "Chun, I want you to demonstrate the escape techniques we covered last week." He gestured to Brooks, who stepped forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Brooks will play the aggressor. Show me how you'd respond to someone with significant size and strength advantage." Sarah felt the setup closing around her. This wasn't a normal evaluation. It was a carefully orchestrated attempt to force her to reveal her capabilities under the guise of academic assessment. Brooks approached with the confidence of someone who had never encountered real violence. He was strong, well-trained in academy fighting techniques, and completely unprepared for what Sarah could do if she chose to stop holding back. The prescribed scenario called for Brooks to attempt various holds and attacks while Sarah demonstrated defensive responses. But Brooks interpreted his role as an opportunity to settle their previous sparring session, where Sarah had embarrassed him in front of the class. His first grab was harder than necessary, his attempt to control her wrist designed to cause pain rather than demonstrate technique. Sarah flowed out of the hold easily, but Brooks immediately escalated, using his size advantage to try to overwhelm her with brute force. "Good reaction time," Master Sergeant Rodriguez called out. "Now let's see how you handle a committed attacker." Brooks took this as permission to abandon the prescribed demonstration entirely. His next attack was a full commitment takedown attempt that would have seriously injured Thompson or any other first-year cadet. Sarah had a split second to decide how to respond. She could allow Brooks to take her down, accepting potential injury to maintain her cover, or she could respond with enough force to protect herself, revealing more of her training than she wanted to show. Her body made the decision before her conscious mind could intervene. As Brooks committed to his takedown, Sarah stepped offline and redirected his momentum, using his own aggression to send him crashing into the mat with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The gymnasium fell silent. Brooks lay on a mat, gasping for air, while Sarah stood over him in a perfect fighting stance that spoke of thousands of hours of training at levels far beyond anything taught at the academy. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stared at her for a long moment. "Outstanding technique, Shen. Where exactly did you learn to move like that?" Before Sarah could answer, Morrison stepped forward. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I'd like to request a formal investigation into Cadet Chen's service records. What we just witnessed goes far beyond basic Navy training." Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Morrison had engineered this situation perfectly. Either she revealed her background to justify her capabilities, or she would be investigated for providing false information on her application. "That won't be necessary," a new voice said from the back of the gymnasium. Everyone turned to see Colonel Hendricks entering with a man Sarah recognized, but had hoped never to see again. Commander Jack Mitchell was her former commanding officer, the person who had led her SEAL team through operations that officially never happened. Mitchell was exactly as Sarah remembered him. Medium height, unremarkable appearance, with eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that commanded immediate respect from anyone with real military experience. "Commander Mitchell," Master Sergeant Rodriguez snapped to attention. "Sir, we were just conducting combat evaluations." "I can see that, Sergeant." "At ease." Mitchell's gaze found Sarah, and she saw a mixture of pride and concern in his expression. "Miss Chun, a word?" Sarah followed Mitchell and Colonel Hendricks out of the gymnasium, leaving behind a room full of cadets buzzing with speculation and confusion. Morrison's face was a mask of frustrated anger. His carefully planned revelation had been interrupted by forces beyond his control. In Colonel Hendricks' office, Mitchell closed the door and activated a small electronic device that Sarah recognized as a signal jammer. Whatever they were about to discuss would not be overheard by Morrison's amateur surveillance equipment. "Sarah," Mitchell said, using her first name in a way that immediately brought back memories of missions briefings and post-operation debriefings. "I heard you were trying to build a new life here. How's that working out for you?" "It was working fine until someone decided to turn it into a demonstration," Sarah replied. her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there since her arrival at the academy. Colonel Hendricks looked between them. "Commander, I think it's time I understood exactly who I have enrolled in my academy." Mitchell nodded. "Colonel, allow me to introduce Senior Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chun, formerly of SEAL Team 6. 4 years of classified operations across 3 continents. Navy Cross recipient, though the citation is sealed. She's officially listed as discharged for medical reasons, though I can assure you her health is excellent." Sarah closed her eyes. Her carefully constructed new identity was crumbling around her, destroyed by a bully's need to prove his dominance, and her own inability to completely suppress her training when threatened. "Medical discharge?" Colonel Hendricks asked. "It's a cover story," Mitchell explained. Sarah burned out on operational deployments. She asked to be discharged rather than accept reassignment to training duty. The Navy agreed because her psychological profile indicated she needed time to adjust to civilian life. And she chose to come here instead of taking that time. Mitchell looked at Sarah with something approaching paternal concern, because she's trying to learn how to be a leader instead of just a weapon. Admirable goal, but it seems the transition is proving more difficult than anticipated. Colonel Hendricks studied Sarah for a long moment. "Is this going to be a problem, Miss Chun? Are you capable of functioning in an academic environment? Or do I need to be concerned about the safety of my other cadets?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah felt the weight of both men's expectations, along with the knowledge that her answer would determine not just her future at the academy, but her entire attempt to build a different kind of life. "Sir," she said finally, "I came here because I want to learn leadership principles that don't involve violence. I've been trying to integrate peacefully with the other cadets, despite increasing provocation. What happened in the gymnasium was a defensive response to an escalating situation." "Provocation from whom?" Sarah hesitated. Naming Morrison directly would turn her conflict with him into an official disciplinary matter, which would likely result in her being removed from the academy regardless of who was at fault. Commander Mitchell answered for her. "Colonel, Sarah has been trained to identify and track potential threats as a matter of survival. If she says she's being provoked, then someone is actively creating problems for her. Any idea who?" Mitchell's smile was razor-thin. "I'd start by looking at whoever was most interested in forcing today's demonstration." Colonel Hendricks nodded slowly. "I see. Commander, I need to understand the extent of Miss Chen's capabilities. If I'm going to have a Navy SEAL in my academy, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Her combat skills are at the level of a special operations professional," Mitchell said simply. "But more importantly, her tactical intelligence and leadership potential are exceptional. She's exactly the kind of person this academy should be developing, assuming you can create an environment where she doesn't need to use her combat training. And if I can't create that environment..." Mitchell's expression grew serious. "Then you'll have a much bigger problem than one difficult cadet. Sarah has spent 4 years learning to solve problems permanently. If someone pushes her past the point where she's trying to be a student instead of a warrior, they're not going to like the solution she provides." After Mitchell left, Colonel Hendricks sat behind his desk, studying Sarah's file. Her real file, which painted a very different picture than the sanitized version she had submitted with her application. 4 years of classified operations, he said finally. Navy Cross. Multiple commendations for leadership under fire. "Why didn't you just apply for officer candidate school?" "Because I wanted to learn to lead people who weren't already warriors," Sarah replied. "I wanted to understand how to inspire rather than command, how to build rather than destroy. And instead you found yourself in a situation where you might need to become a warrior again." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Only if someone forces that choice on me, sir." Colonel Hendricks closed her file. "Miss Chun, I'm going to give you a chance to continue here. But I need your word that you'll find a way to resolve this situation without violence." "You have it, sir." "Good. Because if violence does occur, regardless of who initiates it, you'll be the one held responsible. Fair or not, that's the reality of your situation." As Sarah left the colonel's office, she knew that Morrison had won a significant victory. Her cover was blown. Her background was now known to the Academy's leadership, and she was being held to a different standard than other cadets. But Morrison had also made a crucial mistake. In his eagerness to expose her, he had brought Commander Mitchell into the situation, and Mitchell's presence meant that Sarah's former life was no longer completely behind her. That evening, as Sarah sat in her room updating her tactical assessment of the situation, Jen returned from dinner with a troubled expression. "The whole academy is talking about what happened in the gymnasium today," she said. "Morrison is telling everyone that you're some kind of special forces operative who lied about your background. Davis is claiming you're probably here on some kind of intelligence assignment." Sarah looked up from her notebook. "What do you think?" "I think," Jen said carefully, "that Morrison has no idea what kind of war he just declared." She was right. Morrison had spent 3 weeks trying to force Sarah to reveal her true nature, and now he had succeeded. But in doing so, he had also revealed something about himself. He was the kind of person who would use any weapon available to maintain his position, regardless of the consequences for others. Sarah had been trying to avoid conflict, to find a peaceful path through the academy that would let her build the future she wanted. But Morrison's actions had made it clear that peace was not an option he was willing to accept. The question now was how far he was willing to escalate, and whether Sarah would be able to respond as a cadet or whether she would be forced to become a warrior once again. Either way, the quiet phase of her time at the academy was over. The real battle was about to begin. The week following Sarah's exposure was marked by a careful dance of escalation and restraint. Morrison, having failed to drive her from the academy through his initial gambit, began employing more sophisticated tactics. He couldn't attack her directly, not with Colonel Hendricks watching, but he could make her life systematically unbearable through the 1,000 small torments that institutional hierarchies made possible. It started with her academic assignments. Suddenly, every paper Sarah submitted was found to have formatting errors that required complete revision. Her room was subjected to random inspections that always found minor violations of academy regulations. Her mail was delayed, her library privileges were questioned, and her access to training facilities became mysteriously limited during the hours when she preferred to work out. Morrison was careful to maintain plausible deniability for each incident. The assignment rejections came from different professors who cited legitimate but minor issues. The inspections were conducted by various upperclassmen following standard protocols. The administrative delays appeared to be bureaucratic accidents rather than targeted harassment. But Sarah recognized the pattern. Morrison was using the academy's own systems against her, turning the institution itself into a weapon designed to wear down her resolve. It was actually an impressive demonstration of institutional manipulation, the kind of skill that would serve him well in a political or military career. Sarah's response was to document everything meticulously while maintaining perfect compliance with all academy regulations. She submitted assignments that exceeded requirements, kept her room in immaculate condition, and followed every rule with precision that made it impossible to find legitimate grounds for punishment. But the constant pressure was taking its toll, not on her psychological state. 4 years of operational stress had given her resources for dealing with much worse, but on her ability to maintain the peaceful facade she had come to the academy to build. The breaking point came during a nighttime field exercise in the academy's training area, a wooded section of the campus where cadets practiced tactical movements and leadership scenarios. Sarah's squad was conducting a reconnaissance mission when she realized they were being followed by another group of cadets who weren't part of the exercise. Moving through the darkness with the silent precision that had kept her alive in hostile territory, Sarah identified Morrison, Davis, Brooks, and 2 other upperclassmen positioning themselves to intercept her squad at a predetermined location. They were armed with paintball weapons, standard equipment for training exercises, but their tactical movement suggested this wasn't going to be a friendly simulation. Sarah had 2 choices: alert her squad and turn the situation into an official confrontation, or handle the threat herself before it could develop into something that would put the other first-year cadets at risk. She chose a third option. Using hand signals, She directed her squad to continue their planned route, while she split off to conduct advanced reconnaissance. It was a reasonable tactical decision that would keep the other cadets out of whatever Morrison had planned, while giving her the freedom to respond appropriately to the developing threat. Sarah moved through the forest like a shadow, using terrain and vegetation to approach Morrison's position undetected. Her training kicked in automatically, breathing controlled, movement silent, awareness expanded to encompass every sound and shadow in her environment. Morrison and his team had positioned themselves in a small clearing where they expected Sarah's squad to pass. They were confident, talking in hushed voices about their plan to teach the Navy girls some respect through what they described as intense training pressure. Sarah listened long enough to understand their intentions. They planned to ambush her squad with paintball fire, targeting her specifically while claiming it was part of an impromptu training exercise. The goal was to humiliate her in front of the other first-year cadets while maintaining the fiction that it was educational rather than punitive. What they hadn't considered was that Sarah had spent years learning to turn ambushes against those who attempted them. Moving with absolute silence, Sarah positioned herself behind Morrison's group and began systematically eliminating their tactical advantages. She started by disabling their communication equipment, simple radio jamming techniques that she could implement with equipment from her personal toolkit. Then, she began psychological pressure designed to destabilize their coordination and confidence. The first sign Morrison's team had that something was wrong came when Davis's radio went dead in the middle of a transmission. Then, Brooks reported that his night vision equipment was malfunctioning. Within minutes, the group that had set up to ambush Sarah found themselves dealing with equipment failures and environmental factors that seemed designed to neutralize their advantages. "This is wrong," Davis whispered to Morrison. "The equipment was working fine an hour ago." "Equipment fails," Morrison replied, but his voice carried tension. "We proceed with the plan." That's when Sarah began the psychological phase of her operation. Moving through the forest around them, she created subtle disturbances. Branches moved by invisible hands, shadows that appeared and vanished, sounds that suggested movement but revealed no source. Brooks was the first to crack. "Someone's out there. This is an equipment failure. We're being stalked." "Impossible," Morrison said. "We would have seen them coming." But even as he spoke, Morrison was beginning to understand that they were no longer the hunters in this situation. The forest around them had become hostile territory, and they were trapped in the middle of it with their advantages systematically stripped away. Sarah allowed them to sweat for another 10 minutes before she decided to end the game. Moving with the fluid precision that had made her legendary among her SEAL teammates, she approached Morrison's position from directly behind. "Contact front," she whispered, her voice barely audible but close enough to Morrison's ear that he jumped and spun around, his paintball weapon raised. But Sarah was already gone, having faded back into the darkness before he could acquire a target. "Where is she?" Brooks hissed, his weapon sweeping back and forth as he searched for threats that could be anywhere. "I don't know," Morrison admitted, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, he sounded genuinely unsettled. Sarah's voice came from the darkness around them, seeming to come from multiple directions at once due to acoustic techniques she had learned for psychological operations. "You wanted to teach me about respect," she said, her voice carrying easily through the night air. "Let me teach you about situational awareness." In rapid succession, paintball rounds struck each member of Morrison's team with precision that demonstrated complete tactical dominance. The shots came from different angles, suggesting multiple shooters, and were placed to neutralize without seriously harming, center mass hits that would have been kill shots in a real combat scenario. Morrison spun around, trying to locate Sarah's position, but she had already moved. His return fire hit nothing but trees and shadows. "Lesson 1, Sarah's disembodied voice continued. Never attempt an ambush without controlling the terrain. More paintball rounds found their targets, marking each of Morrison's team members multiple times. The precision was surgical, every shot placed exactly where Sarah intended it, demonstrating a level of marksmanship that none of them had imagined possible. Lesson 2, Sarah continued, her voice now coming from yet another direction. Never underestimate your opponent's capabilities. Davis tried to coordinate a defensive position, but every attempt at tactical movement was met with immediate and accurate fire that forced them to seek cover in positions that actually reduced their defensive capabilities. Lesson 3, Sarah said, her voice now carrying an edge that made it clear the educational portion of the evening was coming to an end. Never start a fight with someone whose job was ending fights permanently. The paintball fire stopped, and the forest fell silent. Morrison's team crouched behind inadequate cover, their equipment malfunctioning, their confidence shattered, and their tactical situation hopeless. When Sarah spoke again, her voice came from directly behind Morrison, close enough that he could feel her breath on his neck. Lesson 4, she whispered. When you outclass someone completely, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them surrender with dignity. Morrison slowly lowered his weapon and turned around. Sarah stood 3 feet away, her own paintball weapon held in a casual but ready position. She had approached close enough to have eliminated him at point-blank range, but had chosen to give him the opportunity to end this confrontation peacefully. This was supposed to be a training exercise, Morrison said, his voice strained. It was, Sarah replied calmly. You just learned more than you expected to learn. Davis and Brooks emerged from their cover, their faces pale and their confidence completely undermined. They had come here expecting to humiliate a fellow cadet, and instead had been systematically outclassed by someone whose capabilities they had fundamentally misunderstood. What happens now? Davis asked. Sarah considered the question for a moment. She could report their attempted ambush to the Academy administration, which would result in disciplinary action for Morrison's team. She could escalate the situation by demonstrating even more of her capabilities, which would establish her dominance, but potentially make her future at the Academy untenable. Or she could find a way to end this conflict that served everyone's long-term interests. Now, she said finally, we return to our respective exercises and pretend this never happened. But it doesn't happen again. And if it does? Morrison asked, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and grudging respect. Sarah's smile was cold and professional. Then I stop pretending to be a student and start being what I actually am. The message was received clearly. Morrison and his team collected their equipment and melted back into the forest, leaving Sarah alone in the clearing. She remained motionless for several minutes, listening to their retreat and making sure they weren't planning any immediate retaliation. When she was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed, Sarah rejoined her squad as if nothing had happened. They completed their reconnaissance exercise without incident, though several of the other cadets commented that the forest seemed unusually quiet for the remainder of the night. Back at the academy, Sarah filed her exercise report with clinical precision, noting all tactical objectives achieved and no significant incidents to report. But she knew that her relationship with Morrison had fundamentally changed. He now understood exactly what kind of person he had been targeting, and he would have to decide whether that knowledge would lead him to seek peace or escalate to a level that would force Sarah to abandon all pretense of being a normal cadet. The next morning brought news that would transform the entire dynamic at the academy. Colonel Hendricks announced during formation that the academy had been selected to host a joint training exercise with active-duty military units. For the next 2 weeks, the cadets would be working alongside Marines, Army Rangers, and Navy SEALs in a complex scenario designed to test leadership and tactical skills under realistic conditions. Sarah felt her stomach clench as Colonel Hendricks continued his announcement. Active duty SEALs would be arriving within days, and there was a strong possibility that some of them would be from her former unit. The carefully constructed separation she had tried to build between her old life and her new one was about to be completely eliminated. But there was also an opportunity in the situation. With professional warriors on campus, Morrison would have to be much more careful about his tactics. And Sarah would have allies who understood her background and capabilities. As formation dismissed, Morrison approached her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Interesting development," he said carefully. "Yes, it is. I suppose you're looking forward to working with your former colleagues." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm looking forward to seeing how Academy cadets perform when they're being evaluated by people who know the difference between training and reality." Morrison nodded slowly. "I guess we'll all find out what we're really made of." "Yes," Sarah agreed. "I guess we will." As Morrison walked away, Sarah realized that their conflict had entered a new phase. The joint exercise would either provide the context for a final resolution between them, or it would become the setting where their confrontation escalated beyond anything the Academy could contain. Either way, the pretense that Sarah was just another cadet was about to end permanently. The only question was whether she would emerge from the experience with a new life she wanted, or whether she would be forced to return to being the weapon she had been trained to be. The next 2 weeks would determine everything. The joint training exercise began on a cold Monday morning with the arrival of 3 helicopters carrying 30 active-duty special operations personnel. Sarah watched from her dormitory window as the aircraft touched down on the Academy's landing field, their rotor wash sending clouds of dust across the meticulously maintained grounds. Among the personnel who disembarked, Sarah immediately recognized several familiar faces. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Torres had been her diving partner on countless underwater infiltrations. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Hayes had been the intelligence specialist who had briefed Sarah for her most dangerous missions. And, stepping down from the lead helicopter was Command Master Chief Daniel Reeves, the senior enlisted advisor who had recommended Sarah for a Navy Cross. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Any hope she had harbored that she could continue maintaining her low profile during the exercise had just evaporated. These men and women had fought alongside her in situations where survival depended on absolute trust and perfect coordination. They knew exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The Academy's auditorium was packed for the opening briefing. Sarah took a seat near the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but Command Master Chief Reeves spotted her immediately. His eyes widened with surprise and what looked like genuine pleasure at seeing her again. Colonel Hendricks opened the briefing with an explanation of the exercise's objectives. The cadets would be divided into mixed teams with the visiting Special Operations personnel, conducting a complex scenario involving hostage rescue, intelligence gathering, and asymmetric warfare tactics. Performance would be evaluated on leadership, tactical innovation, and the ability to integrate different skill sets effectively. This exercise is designed to challenge your assumptions about leadership and teamwork, Colonel Hendricks explained. Some of you will find yourselves leading teams that include personnel with significantly more experience than you have. Others will discover that rank and seniority don't automatically translate to tactical effectiveness. As the colonel spoke, Morrison sat 3 rows ahead of Sarah, his posture rigid with anticipation. This was exactly the kind of high-pressure environment where he expected to excel, where his natural charisma and academy training would allow him to establish dominance over both his fellow cadets and the visiting military personnel. The team assignments were announced after lunch. Sarah found herself assigned to Team 7, led by Cadet Captain Morrison, with Cadet Lieutenant Davis as executive officer. The team also included Chief Torres, Petty Officer First Class Janet Kim from the Army Rangers, and 3 other Academy cadets, including Thompson, her former sparring partner. Sarah's heart sank as she realized Morrison had somehow engineered this assignment. Whether through connections or careful manipulation, he had arranged to be in direct command of her during the most high-profile exercise of the semester. Team 7's first mission briefing took place in a small classroom where Morrison attempted to establish his authority from the beginning. He stood at the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to lead. As team leader, Morrison announced, "I'll be coordinating all tactical decisions and mission planning. I expect immediate compliance with all orders and complete mission focus from everyone on this team." Chief Torres, a veteran of 12 years of special operations, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Petty Officer Kim maintained a neutral expression, though Sarah could see the assessment happening behind her eyes. Our first scenario involves hostage rescue in an urban environment, Morrison continued. Intelligence indicates 12 hostiles holding 4 civilians in a multi-story building. We have limited time, minimal equipment, and no backup. He turned to the whiteboard and began sketching a basic assault plan that relied heavily on overwhelming force and minimal tactical subtlety. It was the kind of approach that looked impressive on paper, but would result in heavy casualties in a real-world situation. "Chun," Morrison said, turning to face Sarah directly, "you'll be assigned to perimeter security. Your job is to maintain communications and provide early warning of enemy reinforcements." It was clearly intended as a slight, assigning the former Navy SEAL to the least critical role in the operation. But Chief Torres spoke up before Sarah could respond. "Sir, if I may suggest, given Chen's background in maritime special operations, she might be better utilized in the actual assault element." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Chief, I appreciate your input, but I'm responsible for tactical assignments on this team." "Of course, sir. I was just noting that Chun has extensive experience with close-quarters combat and hostage rescue operations." The room fell silent as the implications of Chief Torres's words sank in. The other Academy cadets stared at Sarah with new understanding, while Morrison realized that his attempt to marginalize her had just been countered by someone whose opinion carried significant weight with the exercise evaluators. "Very well," Morrison said after a moment. "Chun, you'll take point on building entry, but you follow my tactical plan exactly." Sarah nodded without speaking. She had already identified 17 flaws in Morrison's plan, any one of which could result in mission failure or friendly casualties. But direct confrontation during the briefing would only escalate the conflict without providing a productive resolution. The exercise began at dawn the next day. Team 7 approached the target building, a 3-story structure in the Academy's urban training facility, with Morrison coordinating movement from his command position 50 meters away. Sarah moved toward the building's main entrance with Thompson and Petty Officer Kim, following Morrison's plan despite her growing certainty that it was tactically unsound. The approach route he had chosen exposed them to observation from multiple windows. The timing was too rigid to accommodate unexpected developments, and the entry method relied on speed rather than surprise. As they reached the building's perimeter, Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her situational awareness expanded to encompass every sight line, every potential threat, every tactical advantage that Morrison's plan was failing to exploit. When hostile fire erupted from the second floor, simulated by paint pellets fired from training weapons, Sarah's response was immediate and instinctive. Instead of following Morrison's prescribed entry route, she led her element through a ground floor window that provided concealment and a tactical advantage. Her movements were fluid and precise, born from years of real-world experience where mistakes meant death rather than failed grades. "Chin, what are you doing?" Morrison's voice crackled through a radio. "Return to the planned entry point immediately." "Negative," Sarah replied calmly. "Original route is compromised." Adapting to tactical situation, she continued moving through the building with Thompson and Kim following her lead. Her tactical decisions were being made at a speed and level of sophistication that came from muscle memory and combat experience. When she encountered simulated hostiles, her responses were surgical, precise, efficient, and completely overwhelming. Within 12 minutes, Sarah's element had neutralized all hostile targets and secured all 4 hostages without sustaining any casualties. It was a textbook special operations mission executed with a level of professionalism that left no doubt about her capabilities. Morrison arrived at the building entrance as Sarah was leading the rescued hostages to safety. His face was a mixture of anger and grudging amazement at what his team had accomplished. "Outstanding execution," Chief Torres said as the exercise evaluators gathered for debriefing. "Adaptive tactical leadership innovative problem solving, and perfect mission accomplishment. Command Master Chief Reeves approached Sarah as the team was securing their equipment. "Chin, can I have a word?" They walked away from the group, stopping near a grove of trees where they could speak privately. "How are you adjusting to academy life?" Reeves asked. "It's been educational, Master Chief." Reeves smiled. "I bet it has. Look, I know you came here trying to build something different for yourself. But watching you work today reminded me why you were so effective as an operator. You don't just follow orders, you understand the mission and adapt to accomplish it." Sarah nodded. "That's what I'm trying to learn here. How to lead people who aren't warriors. And how's that working out?" Sarah glanced back toward Morrison, who was engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion with Colonel Hendricks and the other exercise evaluators. "Still figuring that out, Master Chief. Well, here's some advice from someone who's been leading warriors and civilians for over 20 years. Leadership isn't about domination or control. It's about creating conditions where everyone can contribute their best capabilities to accomplish the mission. Some people lead through intimidation, others through inspiration. The best leaders create environments where both approaches can coexist productively." That evening, Sarah found herself alone in the academy library, reviewing tactical manuals and trying to process what had happened during the exercise. Morrison's plan had failed, her improvisation had succeeded, and everyone involved now understood exactly what the capability gap was between them. But more importantly, she was beginning to understand that her conflict with Morrison was really about two different philosophies of leadership. Morrison believed in hierarchy, control, and the assertion of dominance through institutional authority. Sarah had been trained in a tradition that valued competence, adaptability, and the accomplishment of objectives regardless of who received credit. "Chun." Sarah looked up to find Morrison standing beside her table. His expression was unreadable, but his posture suggested someone who had reached a difficult decision. "Can we talk?" he asked. Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. Morrison sat down and was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about what happened today. About this whole semester, actually." Sarah waited for him to continue. "I came to this academy with certain assumptions about how things work. About leadership, about hierarchy, about who belongs where in the chain of command. You forced me to question some of those assumptions." "That wasn't my intention," Sarah said quietly. "I know. That's part of what makes this so complicated." Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The thing is, I'm good at what I do. I'm a natural leader. I understand institutional politics, and I know how to motivate people to accomplish objectives. But watching you work today made me realize that there are levels of competence I've never even considered." Sarah remained silent, letting him work through his thoughts. "The question I keep coming back to is whether we're competing for the same thing or whether we're trying to accomplish different objectives entirely. What do you think?" Morrison smiled ruefully. "I think I've been treating this like a zero-sum competition when it should have been a collaboration. You're not here to undermine my authority or take my position. You're here to learn something I already know, while I could be learning something you've already mastered." It was the first genuine moment of vulnerability Morrison had shown since Sarah arrived at the academy. For the first time, she could see past his aggressive facade to the intelligent, ambitious young man who was genuinely trying to become the best leader he could be. "What are you proposing?" Sarah asked. "A truce. Maybe even a partnership. You help me understand tactical leadership at the level you practice it, and I'll help you navigate the institutional and political aspects of leadership in civilian environments." Sarah considered the offer. It wasn't exactly what she had hoped for when she came to the academy, but it might be something better, a genuine opportunity to bridge the gap between her old life and her new one. "What about Davis and Brooks?" "They follow my lead. If I change direction, they'll adapt. And if they don't?" Morrison's smile became more confident. "Then they'll discover that they're not as indispensable as they thought they were." Sarah extended her hand across the table. "Truce." Morrison shook it firmly. "Partnership." The remaining week of the joint exercise transformed Team 7 into something unprecedented at the Academy. Morrison provided strategic leadership and institutional knowledge while Sarah contributed tactical expertise and operational experience. The combination proved devastatingly effective. During their final mission, a complex scenario involving urban warfare, intelligence gathering, and civilian evacuation, Team 7 achieved objectives that the exercise designers hadn't expected any cadet team to accomplish. They did it through a combination of Morrison's ability to coordinate,